It's great to have Gordon Corera here with us today. We're looking forward to a really interesting and obviously very timely conversation. Gordon has kindly agreed to join us from across the ocean in the afternoon his time and be with us to talk about his book, Russians Among Us: Sleeper Cells, Ghost Stories, and the Hunt for Putin's Spies. You know, we're particularly happy to have Gordon with us today due to the relevance of his writing and his expertise on Russia and intelligence operations. Obviously, something that's very much in the news today, but also something that we have been focusing on at the center for quite some time. Most of our participants will be very familiar with the work that we've been doing on great powers competition and sort of some of the new definitions of that. We are specifically focusing on how that plays out in the space realm, both with relationships to Russia and China, looking at hypersonic weapons, anti-satellite technologies, and the ability to respond to those technologies. We've been focused on competitions on a number of high-tech areas, including 5G communications, artificial intelligence, and other high-tech items. Obviously very important to our national security. We're delving into trying to rebuild bipartisan consensus for arms control discussions with Russia around nuclear weapons. All of this work is really underpinned in so many ways by intelligence. What we're able to gather information-wise determines how successful we as a country and we as a member of a group of allies can be in countering threats. And so being able to focus on how that intelligence is gathered and what our adversaries do to try to collect information on us and how successful we can be in countering them is vitally important. Critically, with the news lately about Russian attempts in Afghanistan to counter our interests and harm our forces, that is an urgent manifestation of this question, but it goes much deeper than that. So again, we're very happy to have you, Gordon, with us to talk about your book, but also to reflect with us on Russian intelligence capabilities and kind of what they're after and how they operate. But let me stop talking because we've got the real expert on intelligence matters here, Chairman Mike Rogers, to give a welcome. And Mike was the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee and has really lived these questions and has put together a multi-season show on CNN about it. So let me turn it over to Mike for his welcome and let him frame it for us. Mike?
Hey, thank you. Thanks, Glenn, and thanks for what you and the center are doing. Gordon, great to see you, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you. I've always enjoyed your work. And one of the things I think about your latest bit is, I always said there's nothing more dangerous than a KGB officer formerly or an SVR or GRU officer now that doesn't drink vodka, right? They are a capable service. Sometimes they get in their own way. But when you look at some of the activities that they've done, both here in the United States to great success in Britain, Syria, the things that they have been able to accomplish, Afghanistan, and that news is, I think, going to be important, and I hope you'll take a minute to address it. You can see the escalation where it benefits them. I know people were shocked about if this is true or not true, and I would argue this wouldn't shock me in the slightest. It is to their advantage to push this envelope when the United States is talking about pulling out. And what I loved about the book is that even with ghost stories where they had all of the illegals here, most of the media, I think, really got it wrong. They talk, oh, this was buffoonery. And they had clips of some of the dumb things that human beings, who, by the way, are spies, do, but didn't look at the long-term strategic implications of what they were trying to do and how successful they were at it. So I think we knock the Russians' capability at our peril. And I think you and your book and your past work really highlights, hey, listen, that may have been a bad op, but this is more serious than you think. And it's in their strategic interest to keep coming back at this and get it right. And all of that, to me, is very, very important as we look at them as a long-term adversary. If their conventional army is worthless or not, and I would argue probably more worthless than not, but all of the places they've invested their money, espionage, cyber espionage, special forces operations, assassination attempt, special intelligence operations around the world has been impactful for them. And the ones we don't hear about are the ones we should be worried about. So Gordon, thank you very, very much. I think your timing couldn't be better. Joshua Huminski, I think, is a little bit prescient on this. He said he knew this was coming. Don't know if he, I think maybe he did. I don't know. But no. Thanks, Joshua, for setting all of this up. Thanks, Glenn. And Gordon, I look forward to your comments.
Thank you both very much for that very kind introduction, and greetings from a sadly quite rainy London here. I'm not sure what it's like where you are, but it's rainy, but certainly Russia is back in the news. Maybe it's felt like it's been a bit out of it. China's perhaps been higher up my agenda in terms of the news reporting in the last few weeks. And I saw Mike Rogers talking actually to one of our committees about 5G and Huawei, which is very much in the news here. But Russia is certainly back. It never went away, and it never went away from the end of the Cold War. And that's really one of the messages of the book and what I wanted to talk to you about. I want to just give a kind of brief outline about some of the kind of key points and themes, certainly not to take people through all the detail. But then I think that will take us to the present and maybe some of those key questions about what Russia is trying to do now and what we're seeing in some of at least the reporting about its recent intelligence operations. Let me take you back though, 10 years, almost to the day. So if you go back 10 years and 7 days ago, so just over 10 years ago, the Russian President Dmitry Medvedev was in Washington, DC, and he was eating a burger with President Obama, and the two were having this very cozy chat actually in a burger joint in Arlington. And it was a study in informality designed to look like that because this was the middle of the reset, the attempt to reset relations between the two countries and improve them after a feeling they'd not gone so well in the previous years. But at that same time, something else was afoot. 10 years and 6 days ago, so one day after the burgers, a Russian SVR officer from their foreign intelligence service said goodbye to his colleagues just outside of Moscow and then made his way out of the country. A year and 5 days ago, Anna Chapman was approached by an undercover officer in New York and asked to go to a meeting the next day. 10 years and 4 days ago, a group of illegals were arrested. That led to a very interesting sequence of events. So around about almost exactly 10 years ago, there had been these very interesting negotiations going on between the CIA and SVR about swapping those illegals, deep cover Russian spies who'd been arrested in the United States, and swapping them for 4 people who were in jail in Russia for spying for the West. And 8 days from now, 10 years ago, there would have been this spy swap at Vienna airport. And that's really, to me, a very interesting moment because I was reporting on it at the time. And I, like a lot of other people at the time, thought it was a kind of weird hangover from the Cold War. I thought, you know, what's going on with these kind of strange spy games? This felt like a kind of retro throwback to a past which we thought had gone, where the two sides were spying on each other. But actually, looking back, that spy swap was much more interesting than people, including myself, I think realized at the time, because it told us quite a lot of things. It told us, firstly, about Russian espionage, that they'd been patient and persistent in their espionage since the end of the Cold War, even when the West, the United States, the UK had perhaps lost its focus on Russia. Russia had kept its focus on the West and on spying on the West. But it was also very interesting, that moment, that spy swap, because of who was being swapped. And you had this group of deep cover SVR illegals who'd been arrested 10 years ago in the United States. And again, they were very interesting. They're very interesting characters because these were illegals who are deep cover spies. Russia specializes in these illegals. They're part of their culture in a way that they're not part of Western intelligence culture. We have spies who go under natural cover, non-diplomatic cover, as businessmen or other things. The Russians take this to a different level. They're illegals, as they call them, in contrast to legal or diplomatic spies, actually change their whole nationality. So a Russian will be turned into a Canadian or an American or a Briton, a long process, and then they will be sent to burrow into their target society. It's a process that can take not just years, but decades. And some of those illegals had been operating for a quarter of a century before they'd been caught. That tells you quite a lot about Russian espionage, that they're willing to invest in people who will burrow deep and spend a long period trying to penetrate their target society. Something Russia specializes in. It's part of their culture, something that Vladimir Putin himself values very highly. They're lauded in their TV programs, in their popular culture. They're in our popular culture as well, because if this all sounds a bit like the TV series The Americans, well, that's exactly where the inspiration for that TV series came from, which were this group of spies, even though the TV series then took it and placed it back into that Cold War period in the 1980s. It's very interesting. We'll come back to the Americans, because I think it's a very interesting TV series, what people made of it. But they'd been able to spend years sometimes bringing up families with children who didn't know that their parents were Russian spies living in America, and trying to gather secrets, not necessarily secrets in the way we often think of espionage in the Cold War, where it was kind of getting that secret from the safe. It was more about influence as much as secrets. It was about people who had influence, people who had power, watching them, understanding them, getting close to them, pointing out people that the SVR, Russian intelligence, the successors to part of the KGB, people that they could potentially target to try and recruit, particularly policy-making circles in Washington. That was always a top priority for them. People with access to interesting, important information. So these were people who'd been sent to do that, and who'd burrowed deep. Those were some of those illegals who were arrested. There were others as well, because there were also a new breed of illegals, people the FBI called true name illegals, because they hadn't changed their nationality. They'd come over to the West, to the United States particularly, as Russians. They were part of a new generation, a kind of post-Cold War generation, who were taking advantage of the fact that ties between Russia and the West had increased since the end of the Cold War. It was possible, in a way it hadn't been in the past, to go over as a student, for instance, and study in the US or the UK, to go over and get a job in policymaking circles in Washington and still be a Russian. So there was a new generation of these true name illegals who'd come over. Anna Chapman is perhaps the most famous, perhaps for obvious reasons. She was a kind of glamorous young woman who'd had a party lifestyle in London and then Manhattan, but there were others as well. Mikhail Semenko was a very interesting one, perhaps for this audience, because he'd pitched up in Washington. He'd studied after studying in the United States, and tried to get jobs in think tanks. And he'd spend his time going to think tank events, would approach people afterwards, give them his card, say he was a specialist on relations, particularly between Russia and China, and was looking for contacts and influence. Now, how much damage did these people do? Well, I'll come back to that in a second, but I think what's interesting is how much they could have done. If you go back in history, Russian illegals had often been very effective. They'd been effective in Britain in the 1930s. They'd recruited a generation of people who were fresh out of Cambridge University, the so-called Cambridge Spies. When they'd been fresh out of university, those students didn't have access to any secrets, but they were recruited and then run by illegals and told to get inside the British establishment. And some of them had got up to senior positions in the British Secret Service, like MI6. Kim Philby famously was liaison with the CIA in Washington and did great damage. Other illegals in the past had run agents who were providing atomic secrets from America. So you can see how they had been able to do real damage when illegals have been able to put down roots, meet people, target people, perhaps get young people and recruit them, who could then act as penetration agents to get inside institutions. And there's plenty of evidence that they were trying to do that in the 2000s. One of those illegals, Cynthia Murphy, had been at Columbia Graduate School in New York, and she'd pitched up at the job fair at Columbia and had actually written down the names of everyone who'd shown an interest in joining the CIA, because the CIA also had a job stall at the Columbia Graduate Fair, and then passed those on to Moscow. So you can see how that kind of information could build up databases, which Moscow could then use to find people who they could target and recruit as spies. Now, in this case, this group hadn't been able to do enormous damage, and the reason was that they'd been watched for a decade by the FBI, and that was because of that person who I mentioned, who 10 years ago and 5-6 days ago had been leaving Moscow, a man called Alexander Patayev, who'd been recruited by the FBI in 1999 when he'd been stationed as a spy at the Russian mission to the UN in New York. He'd been recruited by the FBI, and then he'd been run jointly with the CIA whilst he'd been in Moscow for a decade, passing secrets, including details of those illegals. And that had allowed the illegals to be watched by the FBI, and they'd been closely monitored, and people, when they'd been getting potentially too close to people with secrets, the FBI had been able to subtly intervene and move some of those people away so that the damage couldn't be done. But in 2010, actually, that operation was coming to an end. Alexander Petaev was worried that the Russians were onto him potentially, and he wanted to get out. And that led to a very interesting series of events, which I won't go into in huge detail. I don't want to take up too much time. About a decision about what to do about those illegals. And actually, because it was in the middle of the reset, it became quite a difficult decision. And there were certainly people in the White House who wanted to brush this under the carpet, who didn't want to make a big fuss. They worried it would get in the way of other foreign policy priorities. Some wanted to deal with it quietly without any arrests, perhaps tell the Russians that they knew about these spies, have them picked up. There was quite a big battle within the White House between the intelligence community and the political and diplomatic side. Very interesting to get into that story, but in the end they realized that they were going to have to arrest them, and but rather than having a long prosecution, they opted for a swap, and that swap that took place in Vienna airport on July 9th, 2010, so nearly 10 years ago. Now, that might all seem like history, but I think it's a very interesting and important history. That swap, those arrests, illuminated like a kind of flashlight, like a kind of a lightning bolt, Russian intelligence at a particular moment in 2010. What did it tell us? Well, it told us that Russia had still continued to invest in long-term penetration of the West, in putting in deep cover illegals, in keeping illegals who'd been there since the Cold War, in putting in new illegals through the 1990s, and maintaining that desire to spy on the West. It also told us that they were evolving. They had these new true name illegals, the Anna Chapmans, the Mikhail Semenkos, that they were looking at new methods in order to try and carry on that business of understanding the West and what was going on. It told us they were interested in influence, not just secrets, in trying to understand people who had influence in New York, in Washington, in business, in policy making. It wasn't just about classic espionage of stealing secrets from government. It was also consequential because it caused quite a lot of embarrassment when those illegals were rounded up. It was a time when Dmitry Medvedev was president and Vladimir Putin had kind of stepped back to prime minister, but Putin was angry about it. He's a former KGB officer, after all, who himself had worked with illegals, who lauded them as great heroes, and who was upset at the humiliation. I was told that he threw his papers in the air when those illegals were arrested and he found out about it. He was so angry about it. And I think revenge is an important thing which is not to be underestimated when it comes to Vladimir Putin and those around him in Moscow, and particularly anger at having to swap out 4 Russians who'd been accused of spying for the West in return for getting those illegals back. That was something which would not be forgotten in Moscow, and I'll come back to that later. So the story, though, doesn't really end there in my mind, because it's a moment of transition in Russian espionage. And what you see when you track forward in the last 10 years is a continued shift. And I think it's very easy to think of things as just, we're back in the Cold War. Well, I think that's a mistake. We're not back in the Cold War. Things have changed. Russia is different. The way Russia acts in terms of espionage is different. Its tactics are different. Its motivations are different. Its risk appetite, in some ways, I think is quite different. And you can see that evolution in the following years. You can see it as Putin comes back into power formally as in 2012. He becomes angry at what he sees as American interference backing protests in late 2011, around that time of his return to power. He becomes convinced that the West is trying to undermine and subvert Russia. He becomes determined to try and respond in kind. That's a justification for what he does. And then from 2014, particularly the crisis over Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea, you see Russia effectively viewing itself as in conflict with the West. I think that was underappreciated in the West at the time. I think we still had that quite binary sense of, well, you're either at war or you're at peace. Well, actually, in the Russian mind, there's an ongoing conflict, very much, particularly from 2012, especially from 2014. And intelligence and hybrid warfare, grey zone warfare are the tools with which that conflict is fought. It's fought below the threshold of war. Russia doesn't want to get into an armed conflict. It knows militarily it doesn't have the capacity to take on NATO, but it does have these other tools, and intelligence is certainly one of them. And it's one it's unleashed, I think, in the last few years. It's also realized that cyberspace is a very effective tool for this kind of conflict. It allows Putin to use the West's openness and its digitalization and its vulnerability to some extent in cyberspace. And for Putin, who comes from a kind of judo background, you know, judo is about using your opponent's strengths against them. And so I think he sought to use the West's strengths in terms of its openness, whether it's in cyberspace, digital media, against it. And you can see that in, I think, 2016, you can see what I call the use of cyber illegals. So you had these illegals in the Cold War where decades, frankly, had been invested in them, in which they'd been trained for years as individuals. They were kind of carefully crafted, artisanally produced. Cyberspace allowed Russia to kind of manufacture on a mass scale false personalities and fake identities and people who could look like Americans, and put them out over Twitter and social media and use them to try and influence politics. How effective that was, I think, you know, we can have a debate about how much difference that made, but you can see a shift towards using new tools in cyberspace to do some of the old things that they'd done before, to try and influence, to intervene, to create false personas. You can see it in the way Russia also, again, was more fluid in its use of techniques in espionage. And I think you get to cases like Maria Butina, who was accused of being, if you like, a Russian agent, but she was different from those Russian illegals of the past. She, of course, denied always actually knowingly working for Russian intelligence. And I think a lot of people would see her as someone who was co-opted because she had influential contacts in Washington and other places, and was run or tasked through a businessman, through an oligarch. Again, a different model from the classic intelligence model of illegals in the past, or even the Anna Chapman true name illegal model. So you can see, again, Russia being more flexible in its methods, using different ways of trying to secure influence and manipulate. Then finally, you can see a kind of unleashed Russian willingness to take risks in the way it's used the GRU, which might bring us, I suppose, more towards Afghanistan and what's been happening today. So you can see it in the way the GRU has run cyber espionage operations, quite aggressive, quite noisy cyber espionage operations, for instance, shutting down a French TV channel a few years ago. But then I think significantly, the poisoning in Salisbury with a nerve agent in 2018. And who was poisoned by this unit of the GRU? Well, it was one of those who had been swapped in 2010, Sergei Skripal, who was accused of working for the British Secret Service, MI6, and who clearly some people in Moscow had not forgiven for his actions and for having been swapped and supposedly pardoned in 2010 for the illegals. And 8 years later, a Russian GRU team is sent allegedly to smear nerve agent in a quiet English city on his front door to try and kill him. Now that tells you that the Russian risk appetite has changed, that their willingness to do things which in the past people would have been really surprised at and people might have thought were beyond the expectations, beyond the kind of traditional parameters of intelligence, was suddenly there. I mean, I remember I asked a few months after the nerve agent poisoning, I asked at the public event the chief of MI6 about this, and I said, should he have been better protected? What happened there? And his answer was interesting because he said, well, we had thought this was an agent who'd been swapped out and therefore would have been safe. but it just showed that Russia wasn't really playing by the rules that people thought they were playing by. And by, if you like, those Cold War spy rules didn't really apply in the same way. And its spy services had been unleashed. And I think we've continued to see evidence of that, including in some of these recent reports about what's been happening with that same unit in Afghanistan, and in the willingness to carry out other forms of interference and not very covert activities. So I think what you get a sense of there is Russian intelligence having changed. There are continuities with the Cold War. There is the desire to do the kind of espionage, to do long-term penetration and to try and gather intelligence. And no doubt the SVR, the traditional Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, is still doing things quite stealthily below the radar, perhaps things we don't always hear about. But at the same time, you have the GRU, which has been unleashed as part of what I think Moscow sees as a conflict with the West, to do things in a more open, sometimes reckless, sometimes overt manner. And I think equally, we could talk about this more perhaps, that I don't think the West has done as much perhaps in the past to deter that kind of activity as it could have done. And I think that's been one of the challenges, is to try and work out and understand what kind of conflict this is and what the right tools are to deter that behavior. Because certainly I think in the UK, people would accept that it hasn't always been deterred in the past when we've seen aggressive Russian intelligence activity. And there's a lot more thinking about it now. So sorry to go on for so long. There's clearly a lot to talk about, but hopefully that's brought us from the past to the present and maybe open the way up for some questions or some thoughts. I can go into plenty more detail about any of those points that interest people.
Well, Gordon, first of all, thank you very much for that really interesting description of the stories that you've laid out in the book. Your expertise on this area is really exciting for us. It sounds like there's a lot of great anecdotes and just really, really great sort of reads in the story. So we look forward to looking at that. And I wanted to open it up to questions and just remind participants that you can either submit a written question with the Q&A tab, or you can open the participants panel and raise your hand, and Dan Mahaffey is going to field audience questions. Perhaps I can seed this discussion with the first question. You've mentioned, Gordon, the concepts of judo and deterrence. And I'm wondering if you might tell us, what have you seen as one of the most effective ways that Putin has used that judo skill and intelligence against the West? And perhaps, can you describe one or more of the most effective ways that Western intelligence agencies have been able to create some kind of response or deterrence that's effective? So after that, we'll go to Dan for the other questions. Thank you.
Sure. So I think the judo slam has been most effective in cyberspace. And I think it's very interesting because if you go back 7-8 years, you'd have seen Russia being quite insecure about the internet. And the famous quote from Putin is that the internet was a CIA project. And in his mind, that's what it was. It was something designed to spread Western openness and values, and therefore undermine the grip of people like him on their country. And you could sense a kind of insecurity about it, in the sense that it carried with it values and potentially surveillance from Western intelligence, as the Snowden revelations, perhaps reinforced in his mind. But what you see is him and Russia realize that it can use the West's openness, it can use the West's free media, it can use the West's open social media space, and some of the positives of the West in terms of free speech to try and drive a wedge in Western societies and to create division. And I think that's where the judo slam has been most effective. And I think where it's caused all kinds of tensions, I think, within the West about how to respond and where does the responsibility lie, and how do you deal with free speech if people are manipulating it, and where do you deal with foreign actors if they're seeding information into Western journalists through platforms or other ways. And it's caused lots of kind of difficult conversations, including, I think, for those of us who are journalists, because I think Russian intelligence has learnt how to fight this kind of hybrid warfare in a very interesting way. and in a way in which I don't think Western governments are comfortable necessarily fighting themselves because of some of our different values. And I don't think, I don't think it's always a question of doing what your opponent does. So I think cyberspace, digital, social media, cyber vulnerabilities are where we've seen Russia kind of carry out that kind of Putin judo slam. In terms of deterrence, I think it's an interesting one. I'll give you a kind of UK perspective just for a minute if I can, which is that I think there was, if you go back in terms of kind of Russian intelligence operations, perhaps one of the most aggressive before the last few years would have been the killing of Alexander Litvinenko in London in 2006 with radioactive polonium. And I think it's easy to forget, that was a radioactive substance which was, delivered in London and potentially which could have endangered many people's health and many members of the public. I mean, it was a kind of an amazing thing to do. At the time, all the fears were about kind of nuclear terrorism from Al Qaeda. Well, here was a kind of a radioactive material unleashed in London, but by another state. And if you go back, what did the British state do in response? And the answer is almost nothing. At the time, almost nothing. It expelled a handful of Russian diplomats a few months later, but it took years for an inquiry to take place. It took years for there to be any action. And one of the issues is there's always been this tension in London because there's a lot of Russian money in London. There's a lot of Russian influence in London. There were a lot of people who said, well, we need to work with the Russians. And I think there was a recognition in hindsight that Russian activity had not been sufficiently challenged. And I think what you saw after the Skripal poisoning in 2018 was something quite different from the UK, in that it acted much, much more quickly, expelled a large number of Russian diplomats who were suspected to be intelligence officers straight away, but also it coordinated international action, including with the US, including with others. I think about 150 Russians were expelled. And it sent a very different message. And I think the view is that did surprise Moscow and may have acted more of a deterrent. So I think, the lesson is there that there are things that can be done, particularly collectively, which may act as a deterrent. I think there are particular issues which Russia is sensitive about. And I think you can see their sensitivity about the Magnitsky Act and about Russian money, which is abroad, and where that money has come from. That's a point of sensitivity for Russia and a point of potential deterrence, although that involves costs sometimes to people in the West. But I think that you get a sense there that there are ways in which deterrence can be played out, but it's taken some time, I think, to understand this.
Thanks, Dan.
Getting some good questions in here. The first one I would like to ask from our audience, and we acknowledge that we've had times in our history of red scares, perhaps overreaction as well, but how do you educate the public in open Western societies to understand that there are these illegals in cyberspace, or that social media and these forums are being used by foreign intelligence, particularly Russia?
It's a good question. And I think the answer is it's important for information to come out. And, obviously I'm a journalist and a writer, so it's in my interest for information to come out, but I do believe government needs to, and has perhaps learnt more to be open about what it knows. Now, obviously, there's going to be sources and methods, there's going to be agents, there's going to be, all kinds of things which cannot be talked about. But I think one of the things that you've seen in the last few years, including after some recent events, is actually more can be put in the public domain in a balanced and informative way, whether it's through indictments, whether it's through public statements, whether it's in the wake of events, whether it's scientific evidence, to whether it's kind of sanitized intelligence, to allow people to have a bit of an understanding of this, and material which people can get to grips with. And of course, some people will dispute it. Journalists will investigate it, people argue about it, but you've got a kind of body of work there which can at least become the foundation for a discussion and for further understanding. I mean, just one more point that I think is important is, the operation to investigate these illegals was called Ghost Stories. And it's a very telling title, because I think these were in some ways ghosts. They'd stolen the identities, actually, in some cases, of deceased children. And, so literally these were illegals who'd kind of been raised from the dead in a slightly grisly way. But the other reason I think ghost stories is a good description of the operation is there's a risk of starting to see ghosts and see the Russians as ghosts who are everywhere. And I think one of the important lessons I think I've had from researching and writing about it is that we have to be measured in how we see Russian intelligence. I think it's very easy sometimes to go, the Russians are everywhere. The Russians are all powerful. The Russians are, doing all of these things, and they're all brilliantly effective. And actually, that's not true. Also, there's a tendency to go, well, they're kind of, look at this. In 2010, they were caught. They were a bit incompetent. There was kind of, Anna Chapman. Recently, even with the Skripals, these were people who, were kind of looked stupid when they're on Russian TV talking about, having been to Salisbury to see the church spire rather than, to carry out an intelligence operation. They're figures of fun. And I think, one of the things we have to do is have a kind of sensible, nuanced, fair and balanced understanding of Russian spies. They are not clowns, but nor are they 10 feet tall. And I think there is a risk of seeing them everywhere and seeing them as kind of ghosts who are, kind of ever present, haunting us. And I think there is that danger that they can kind of almost haunt us. And that in itself does the Russians work for them if we play up that mythology. So I think, I hope that what I've tried to write in the book is a kind of, it's got the kind of exciting stories, but also there's a kind of a balance to it to get that sense of understanding and perspective about Russian espionage right.
That dovetails with this next question, and you mention it, and I know every time I plan a trip to the UK, the first thing I think about is the Salisbury Cathedral, to be able to see that. But in those instances that seem somewhat buffoonish or we would consider embarrassing, is there a way in the sense that the Russians want to be caught doing this, that they want the awareness of this to be out there? And do we in a way magnify, obviously something like using a nerve agent is serious enough, but do we also, as you say, over magnify some of these instances of buffoonery?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And I think, it's one that, journalists and writers, have to be careful about, because I think we love the drama of the spy stories, but, do we risk magnifying their importance? And as I said, with the illegals, they were, it's quite an interesting one trying to kind of gauge how significant they were, because they didn't do any damage, but that was because they've been watched. And you're right about, Salisbury. Again, it's an interesting one, because I think it is tempting to see them as figures of fun. But then you remember, actually, they didn't kill Sergei Skripal, but a woman, Dawn Sturgis, picked up a perfume bottle a few months later, an innocent woman who had nothing to do with, espionage or spying or anything else, and she died as a result of the nerve agent that left behind. I think, the thing you have to look at with some of these operations is that they were reckless and aggressive, but they can also be sloppy. And I think all those things can go together. You can be pretty reckless and aggressive and sloppy, and you cannot worry too much about being caught. But, there's still some odd elements about that Salisbury operation. The fact they didn't seem to, there's a lot of CCTV in the UK, and they were caught on CCTV. Did they not know? In which case they were sloppy, or did they not care? In which case they were reckless. My own personal view is that actually, in many cases, the Russians they want a kind of what some people have called, I think quite accurately, implausible deniability. So they want, they want to be able to deny it, say, where's your proof? This wasn't us. But actually, they don't mind everyone knowing that they did it, because part of the reason for Salisbury, I think, was to act as a deterrent to anyone else in Russia who might be thinking of spying for the West, and to say to them, hey, if you do it, 8 years later, we will come after you and we will try and kill you. That was the message they were trying to send. So it wasn't simply about wanting someone dead. There were ways of doing that more quietly. It was about wanting to send a message to some extent, but just having just enough, as I said, implausible deniability about it to be able to, kind of try and fend off some of the international pressure as a result. So I think you know, there's a kind of complicated way in which they've been willing to take some pretty aggressive actions and not worry too much about being caught. And again, I just think that suggests a different posture that they have in how they're willing to use intelligence and covert or not very covert operations in order to pursue their ends, and not necessarily always worry that much. You've seen it in cyberspace as well, about eventually the finger being pointed at them. And perhaps that goes back to that question about deterrence then.
You mentioned too that the illegals had been under observation in the US when they were here, the ones caught in 2010. But a question from our audience is that given how quickly they were swapped after their arrest, was there a missed opportunity for further counterintelligence gathering, raising the stakes of the swap? Were they handed over too quickly?
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think there was definitely a debate at the time. I mean, there were people who would have liked to have a full prosecution of these illegals, to put them in jail, to also expel a load of Russian diplomats stroke intelligence officers and really make the most of it, and who felt more could have been done. As I said, there were others who actually thought, you know, we're trying to reset the relations with Russia. We need Russia in terms of, you know, Iran sanctions and other issues. So we'd like to sweep it under the carpet. So what you ended up getting was a kind of compromise in terms of a swap of 10 for 4. Now that might sound imbalanced, 10 for 4, but actually, you know, the Russians didn't want to give up those, really didn't want to give up those 4. I mean, you know, these were people that they really, it's the equivalent, you know, I say in the book about the US, some US kind of, you know, spies being arrested in Moscow, and Russia saying, well, if you want them back, you're going to have to give up Aldrich Ames and Robert Hansen, release them. That's the equivalent, you know. So it was still pretty tough on the Russians. On the one hand, it could have been tougher. I think that's true. In terms of intelligence value, I think the FBI, and certainly when I've spoken to them, believe that they extracted all the intelligence value they could have got from those illegals by watching them. And they're, you know, I suppose they wondered whether they might get some kind of confession or more information, but they didn't. There wasn't much more they could get about them since they'd been watching them for 10 years, and they'd actually been inside their covert communications and knew what you know, what they'd been asked to do. So there wasn't necessarily much more intelligence value. The value for them was in the swap and seeing what they could get for them.
Just a quick follow-up. Do we know what happened to the 2 illegals who got away? Any inkling, any clues?
Oh, some of the illegals who were in the US, you mean? Yeah, well, what's interesting is, and this is a kind of, is that there were more illegals. And there are, there were some illegals in Latin America, there were some illegals in Europe, and actually when in the wake of those arrests, an illegal in Spain gets pitched at by MI6 and he kind of heads back. And there's actually a kind of global roundup of illegals. You know, I tried to get to the bottom of this in the book, but I think, you know, dozens were identified, and some headed back to Moscow. Who knows what happens to others? So this is a story with tentacles, which I think are still going, and some of the threads, I was told, are still being pulled of that operation. But you know, one of the other illegals, Koretnikov, had actually been in the West Coast, and he'd been trying to get into tech firms, work in I think it was Microsoft at the time, and they didn't have enough evidence on him. So he was kind of confronted and was basically told, head back to Russia, which he did. So there were different outcomes as well as those 10 who were swapped.
One of the other participants we've had in these discussions, Mark Galeotti, has talked about the SVR, the GRU, the FSB. And do you think there's actual competition between these agencies and bureaucratic politics fighting for influence that we should better understand rather than creating a monolith of Russian spy agencies?
I think that's absolutely right. And I think it is important to disentangle the different agencies and to understand they have different postures. And you can see, for instance, in the last few years, we've heard a lot more about the GRU. You know, and as I said, you know, that's the unit's been identified in these reports about Afghanistan. It's the unit linked to Salisbury. and to me, that suggests that the GRU is one that it's a military intelligence unit. It's a kind of pretty aggressive operators. And you get a sense that particularly since 2014, when, as I said, I think Russia views itself as having been in conflict with the West, because it's in a conflict, a group like the GRU gets unleashed and gets basically told, go out and do stuff in a way it might not have done in the past. Whereas the SVR has always tended to operate much more beneath the radar, and I'm sure still is at the moment. You can see that even in cyberspace. So even when you look at the 2016 US election, the kind of activities within the Democratic Party, the hacking of it, you actually had the SVR and the GRU both in the Democratic Party system. The SVR was much stealthier and the GRU was much noisier. So you can see the difference there. And certainly I think they compete. And one of the things I got a sense of researching this book, was actually some of the competition. And for instance, the FSB has become increasingly important. Vladimir Putin himself, was a kind of director of the FSB. It's grown in status and stature. The SVR had a big knock in 2010 because of the arrest of the illegals. And you can sometimes sense, the FSB is trying to kind of take on aspects of the SVR's work. It's trying to compete with them. So certainly it's not monolithic. And I think, you'd say the same about Western intelligence agencies. But I think, where there's, the competition is sometimes pretty tough, I think, on the Russian side. And I think understanding that and those dynamics, I think, is very interesting. And I'm sure there are people who spend a lot of time trying to understand those divisions and trying to understand what that means. But yeah, I think it's certainly not a monolith.
Given some of the technological changes we see and the way the Russians are reliant on human intelligence in some ways, but we see biometrics, we see increased data, transparency across different environments, groups like Bellingcat able to dig into backgrounds through open source. How do you think their spycraft will have to change given the changing technological and surveillance environments?
I think that's a really important and kind of profound question, because one of the things I understood in the book, and which really came home to me, was actually some of those changes started in the 2000s. And Russian spies were among the first to realize that, for instance, the old deep cover illegals, the people who'd stolen the identities of their dead children, the kind of the American style spies, it was going to get harder to do that. And actually 9/11 was a key reason for that, because you started to see greater use of databases to understand people's identities, to connect the dots about who people were, to start to use biometrics in terms of passports and border checks. All of that makes it much harder to be a spy generally, to kind of pick up a passport and go and meet in another country under a different cover, but particularly to be an illegal. And so that was one of the reasons I think they started to use more of the kind of Anna Chapman true name illegals, because you haven't got that problem with backstopping, with trying to develop a fake identity which can withstand biometrics, the world of social media, all those challenges. So actually Russian spies were among the first, I think, to adapt to that in the 2000s and adapt their illegals to this new world. But what you see, and you see lots of countries and lots of intelligence agencies, including the US, Israel and others, have had issues where, their intelligence agents got caught out in the 2000s through to kind of 2010, 2011 by, things like CCTV, by kind of, phone link, analysis and things like that. So you see this kind of growing awareness within the spy world, I think really from the 2000s onwards, that it's changing, that the ability to go undercover is profoundly changing. Doesn't mean it's impossible, but it becomes much harder to create those backstories, to create plausible social media profiles, to deal with biometrics, to deal with large-scale databases. And of course, you see that, you see the concern about that much more now as well with China, with kind of the OPM breach, with some of the the way in which China has been collecting large data sets and what it might be able to do with that. So I think spying is definitely changing and being challenged. And then you have this issue of open source investigations, where you don't need the resources of a state or of a security service or a counterintelligence agency to be able to find spies now. Bellingcat has shown how capable a group of people, you know, outside of government can be at identifying intelligence agents, and not just, you know, identifying one or two, but then being able to go, well, let's see who else's car is registered to, you know, in the same way, or who else's passports have sequential numbers, and then being able to identify, you know, larger sets. And so I think you can sense there that that is really profoundly challenging the nature of espionage. You know, I think only those intelligence agencies which, you know, are capable of adapting will survive to actually be able to do some of this high-end human intelligence in a very surveillance-rich world. It's, you know, it's going to become much more of a challenge to be able to do that, and, you know, only the best will be able to play at that level, I think.
It's a follow-on to the earlier question about the different intelligence agencies, in a sense of both their competition, but as well as their ability to operate, innovate, be entrepreneurial. Are things like the Montenegro coup attempt, perhaps what we may have seen in Afghanistan, are these agencies kind of running on a long leash and able to go further than the Kremlin might be, or within a bound of acceptable behavior? Or are there some trying to show that they're trying to establish their chops, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, it's another good question. It's one that I definitely know people have kind of pondered over with some of the more aggressive operations, you know, including things like the Skripal poisonings. Is that something which, you know, Vladimir Putin personally needs to sign off on because it's so high risk? Or is it, you know, there's a few views. One is that, you know, something that high risk, you know, he'd sign off on. The other one is that there's a standing order which says, you know, go after traitors. And, you know, whenever you get the opportunity, do it. There's another view which says, actually, you have got intelligence agencies which are competing, you know, to gain favor and have a perception of what the leadership, what the Kremlin wants, and will compete to do that. You know, I'm not sure we have a perfect answer about that, and it may be different in different situations. You know, my sense is that they're given a reasonably long leash and given some pretty broad parameters and you know, about in which they can operate, and then they go off and see what they can do. And if they go a bit too far, sometimes, you know, maybe they'll or more to the point, if they get caught going too far, then maybe they'll get, you know, kind of reined in or slapped down, or, you know, a boss will get into trouble. But on the whole, there's quite a wide degree of latitude, but that latitude is set from the top.
And this is a broader question, but looking at the clock, I feel it's one that you might have a more elaborate answer, as well as it can feed into some concluding remarks that you might have. But you've looked at both the Russians and their intelligence. You're now looking at China as well, Huawei, Chinese intelligence. What are some of the similarities and differences between Russia and China's efforts that we should understand in this environment? And what are some of the lessons you think between the two, and perhaps their own intelligence relationships as well?
Wow. I'll do that.
I know that could be a whole other
yeah,
segment.
that's a lecture, but you know, I think it's sometimes easy to say, well, you know, the Russians do it this way and the Chinese do it this way. And then, you know, the old view was the Chinese are kind of, you know, it's a vacuum cleaner approach to intelligence. They just kind of, you know, they kind of hoover it all up and, you know, and go for mass collection, whereas the Russians are more targeted. You know, I think, you know, there's some truth to that, but equally each can do the other thing. And I think it's, you know, I kind of wonder whether there's a sense in which each country will play to what it sees as its strengths and its particular outlook. So they're not going to be the same. I mean, you know, Russia has, you know, a more, you know, sees itself as in a conflict, is more willing to take certain risks, is clearly willing to push the boundaries, you know, use of nerve agents, you know, potentially this, you know, issue about bounties. In a way that we've not necessarily seen the Chinese, but the Chinese perhaps have different economic levers and they have different digital levers from Russia, you know, whereas Putin had to do that kind of judo slam I talked about of using the West's openness and social media. Well, China has, you know, the potential for technological growth and, you know, espionage through technology in a way that, you know, Russia perhaps doesn't. And so I think, you know, what will be interesting to see is, and different intelligence priorities as well. You know, China has tended to, you know, kind of place quite a high value on, you know, kind of intellectual property and some of the kind of economic and commercial sides, although Russia's, you know, done some of that as well. You know, and I think they've both done a lot of work on counterintelligence as well, but in different ways. So I think, you know, I think you can expect to see slightly different, you know, paths, and that's what you'd expect. You know, you'd expect them to have different doctrines, different intelligence requirements, you know, and different strengths in their mind that they can play to when they carry out espionage. And so I think, you know, if you're sitting in a country which is worried about that, then you need to be, you know, flexible and see quite a kind of broad front, you know, that you're working, you know, on and against. And I think that's one of the challenges, you know, to kind of wrap up, is that it's not, you know, the Cold War. It's not as simple as just the kind of old spy versus spy, you know, kind of, you know, in the shadows of Berlin espionage that we associate with kind of, you know, old Cold War espionage. There's a new world of digital and cyber and, you know, human-enabled cyber espionage and cyber-enabled human espionage and, you know, use of infrastructure and supply chains to carry out espionage. There's a much more kind of complicated world out there in which intelligence and intelligence kind of battles take place. And, you know, I think that's a kind of pretty big challenge.
Well, thank you, Gordon. That was a, you know, a PhD in intelligence question prompt that you handled well in a few moments there. So thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to Glenn.
Just want to say a really big thank you to BBC Security Editor Gordon Corera for joining us from the other side of the pond today to provide some very insightful commentary on Russian intelligence. And on behalf of Chairman Mike Rogers, myself, and the entire community of the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, we appreciate you sharing these thoughts with us today and talking to us about your book, Russians Among Us, Sleeper Cells, Ghost Stories, and the Hunt for Putin Spies. An exciting read. Thank you for doing the work and putting the book together, and thank you for your efforts to keep the West informed about these important topics. Appreciated having you. And to all of the attendees that joined us, thank you. Everybody stay well. For the Americans, happy 4th of July weekend. And everybody take care.
Thanks. You very much, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.